This evening we're focusing on herbal leys and looking at what they can deliver for pollinator resources, for soil, for potential weed control, and how they fit into a profitable farm business as well. We have 18 hectares of herbal leys at Hope Farm, and I do just want to start off that we're not saying herbal leys are definitely going to deliver all of the above, but with the right management, they can be a really useful tool. We're using them at Hope Farm, paid under the Sustainable Farming Incentive, on fields that are quite tricky to manage, and we need to do some things to improve the structure, to improve their fertility, and to help get on top of weed, pest, and disease issues. So herbal leys seem like quite a good option for us. It secures a bit of income for a few years, and with the right establishment, hopefully, the right mixes and sort of the right management as we're going through our time growing those herbal leys, with some sheep grazing them, we hope that they will be able to deliver all we want. But it's certainly not easy, and there's lots of things to consider. I think it's also important to recognise that actually herbal leys are a really valuable tool, but they do cost money, and a lot of farmers are growing them with support of either countryside stewardship or the Sustainable Farming Incentive. And it is really tricky now that we've lost that support. For the time being, or for new entrants, it's going to be very difficult to do those things. That said, there are lots of farmers out there with herbal leys in place, and there's always more to learn about things. I'm looking forward to learning an awful lot this evening, as we're certainly by no means herbal ley veterans, and are always looking for new bits of advice on what we could do. So without further ado, I want to use as little time as possible myself, so that we can hear from our wonderful speakers today. If everybody is happy to just put themselves on screen for a couple of minutes. We've got Lizzie and Lynn from ADAS, who are going to talk about research behind how herbal leys might deliver for soil and for weed control. We've got Bex, who is from Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and we'll talk about how herbal leys might deliver for pollinators. And Angus, who is a fantastic farmer from up north, who's grown herbal leys in all sorts of different situations in his substantial farming business. And really looking forward to hearing the sort of the practical side of things and what he's finding, how it's delivered on his farm. And we also have Hannah here, who's a placement student working at Hope Farm, who has done an amazing job of helping to organise these webinars so far, and is also going to be there in the background with any technical issues, which hopefully we won't have. So thank you very much, everybody. And we're now just going to keep Lizzie and Lynn on for the first talk. So to hear a bit more about Lizzie and Lynn, they, from ADAS, have many years of experience researching the management of farmland for healthy soils and looking into cultural weed control methods. They're going to discuss the evidence behind herbal ley management to deliver for both of those things. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you. Can you see that? Is that on full screen view, all right? Perfect. Thanks, Georgie, and thanks to everyone for joining today. So, yep, I'm Lizzie Sagoo. I'm a soil scientist at ADAS, based at Boxworth, so close to Hope Farm. I have a particular interest in grass and herbal leys, and we've done various bits of work in this area over recent years. Integration of grass and herbal leys and livestock into arable rotations has the potential to provide benefits to both arable and livestock farming systems. We all know that we've seen that continuous arable cropping with annual cultivations and little or no inputs of organic matter has led to this sort of longer term decline in soil organic matter content that we've seen, across farms and across the country. By taking land out of that annual cultivation, increasing the return of organic matter in the form of root and litter turnover, as well as via grazing animals on the leys, these sorts of temporary leys have the potential to improve soil organic matter and soil quality, which can potentially have wider rotational benefits So in this short presentation, I'm just going to talk a bit about soil health and what we know about integrating leys, how integrating leys into the rotation can benefit soil health. So let's start with the soil. Sustainable soil management is central to delivery of resilient and economically productive cropping systems. Managing soil to maintain soil quality, it's really all about soil organic matter management. Why is that? That's, recognizing soils are a living system. We can see that the majority of soil functions, whether that is nutrient and water supply, carbon storage, etc., these are all driven by biological processes underpinned by soil organic matter decomposition. So really, soil organic matter underpins everything. It's the energy source for all soil biology, which then in turn drives nutrient cycling. And the actions of soil biology are also extremely important for soil aggregation and structural development, which has implications for how much water a soil can hold. So if we want to look at the condition of our soils, analysis for soil organic matter gives a good overall indicator of soil health. So if we want to maintain and increase our soil organic matter, what should we be doing? We need to increase input to organic matter and reduce our losses. So we can add more carbon to the soil by increasing the return of crop residues, adding organic materials like livestock manures and composts. We lose carbon from the soil to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and to water as either dissolved organic carbon or soil particles lost by erosion. So we can reduce the losses by reducing our cultivations, and this will help preserve soil organic matter as cultivating the soil oxidizes organic matter, and obviously making sure we don't lose soil via erosion. One very effective way of building soil organic matter, particularly in arable rotations, is to put them down to pasture. Now, whilst many predominantly arable farmers might not want to put their arable fields down to permanent grassland, introducing temporary grass or herbal leys may be an option on some farms. Putting land down to leys can increase soil organic matter by, firstly, it's the lack of tillage. So we've said that already that tillage and cultivation oxidizes organic matter, and so reducing or no tillage will help build the organic matter. And secondly, also through the grass roots and the residue return and through the dung deposited by grazing animals. And we do have evidence to show the increase in soil organic matter when land is put down to grass. So the graph you can see on the screen now, this is data from a field site we worked at near Farringdon in Oxfordshire. This site was heavy clay soil of the Denchworth Association. In 2001, the land had been in long-term arable production, and we split the site into plots with half down to ungrazed grassland and half stayed in arable. And after 6 years, the soil organic carbon content increased by about a quarter, so demonstrating that benefit. But there's also really good data on the impact of leys in the rotation on soil carbon from the Rothamsted long-term ley arable experiment at Woburn, which has started in 1938. So, I mean, it's fantastic to have this sort of long-term study data. The soil at Woburn is a sandy loam soil, and at the start of the experiment, it had just under 1% organic carbon following more than 60 years of arable cropping. Where the soil remained in that continuous arable cropping, you can see the organic carbon continued to decline. And this decline was greater where root crops were included in the rotation. In contrast, the soil organic carbon in the ley arable rotation increased steadily over time, although inclusion of lucerne in the ley didn't have any additional benefit in terms of soil carbon. So more recently, we did a bit of work with AHDB Beef and Lamb, looking at integrating beef into arable systems on temporary grass and herbal leys. So we worked at Norwood Farm in Somerset as part of this project. This farm was long-term arable until 2016, when it was purchased by Dyson Farming and transitioned to a mixed arable beef and sheep farm. This is a map showing part of the farm. What we did here, there were 6 fields on the farm that had been in long-term arable and were sown to grass in autumn 2017 and formed part of the project. So 3 of those fields, Nor 1, 2 and 8 on this map, were sown with the grass clover mix. 2 of the fields were split, with half sown to grass clover and half to a herbal mix. Those were Nor 5 and Nor 6 on the map. And the herbal mix included red and white clover, plantain, chicory, burnet, sheep's parsley, yarrow, and bird's foot trefoil. And the final field, North 7, was split in half, with half down to grass clover and half remaining in arable rotation to give us that contrast. So all the fields were in wheat in 2017. We established the grass and herbal mixes in autumn 2017, and then all fields were in the grass and herbal mixes in 2018, 2019, and 2020, so 3 years. And then in 2021, North 7, that split grass arable field came back into the arable rotation, the whole of it, and was cropped with spring barley. At the beginning of the project in autumn 2017, just before we sowed the leys, we carried out detailed baseline soil assessments across the 6 fields. We looked at indicators of soil physical, biological, and chemical condition. And then we repeated those measurements 3 years later in autumn 2020. And then by looking at that change between 2017 and 2020, we were able to quantify the impact of the leys on soil quality. So the headline message is that the leys significantly increased soil organic matter content and earthworm numbers over the 3 years. So I think it's important to acknowledge that these soils were actually in pretty good condition when we started in 2017. They are heavier clay soils in the wetter west part of the country, and we know that heavier texture soils and wetter soils tend to hold on to organic matter more. The average organic matter content when we started was just under 8%. So, and the soil structure was actually in reasonable condition as well. But over the 3 years, we saw the organic matter increase, organic matter as measured by loss on ignition, increase from 7.8 to 8.1%. So a 0.3 percentage point increase, and that increase was statistically significant. We didn't measure any differences between the grass clover and the herbal mixes. And to be honest, I'm not surprised by that. Both of those mixes did well. And the main big change here is the shift from arable to grassland. And importantly and interestingly, the number of earthworms in the grassland fields increased by 60% over the 3 years. And the total earthworm biomass in the grass fields increased 3-fold. So some significant increases there. So it's fair to expect that, I think, if you're able to introduce these leys into, what's mainly an arable rotation, there will be a positive impact on soil quality over the longer term. We'd expect them to see these levels rise. But can I tell you how much the organic matter will rise on your farm and your ley? No, that's far more challenging. It will depend on your soil type, your initial soil organic matter levels, and to a certain extent by how much rainfall you get as well. It will probably also depend on how you manage your ley. And this is where there's still quite a few knowledge gaps and things that we still need to look at. So other factors, such as length of ley is important, whether there's a difference between cutting and grazing. So cutting removes the material, whereas grazing will return it to the land. Questions about grazing intensity, practices that promote increased net primary productivity should increase root and litter return. So things like extending the grazing intervals, not grazing too short, rotational or mob grazing rather than continuous grazing. And then also soil composition, can we see a difference in soil quality between grass swards, legume-rich swards and biodiverse swards as well? Another important one to flag is destruction techniques to establish the next crop. The difference between ploughing, min-till, or even direct drilling. Anything that cultivates and disturbs the soil potentially might knock that benefit that we've built during the ley period. And also a big question about what's the benefit to the following arable crop. We can hypothesize that integrating leys into arable rotation should have a positive impact on the next arable crop. A general improvement in soil quality, increase in net mineralization, particularly if there were legumes in the mix, and maybe also improved weed control may all contribute to a yield boost for the following crops. And interesting, at Norwood Farm that I mentioned, where we had that split ley arable field, we did measure a 0.7 tonne per hectare increase in the following arable crop, which was really interesting to see. So I think on that note, that's probably a good moment for me to pass over to my colleague Lynn, who will talk about weed management and leys. So I'll stop sharing now and pass to Lynn.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Can you see that? Super. Thanks, Lizzie. That's great. So yeah, my name's Lynn Tatnell. I'm a weed biologist, also based at ADAS Boxworth, just down the road from Hope Farm. So very similar soil type and blackgrass issues weed-wise, as Georgie has described earlier on. So I'm going to kind of discuss weed management aspects of leys and then talk a little bit about weeds as a problem, but also weeds perhaps as benefits as well. So I don't seem to be able to move my slides on.
It might be if you click it rather than click the arrow.
There we go. Okay, thank you. So yeah, as I said, so I'm going to talk about problem weeds, where your ley fits into your rotation, particularly if you are doing a short-term ley, breaking the weed seed cycle. So that's something really important that I'll keep coming back to. Thinking about control options and the tools you have, and also using this ley as a tool. It really is a cultural control tool for weed management. And then management for success and how you can measure that. So I'm going to start with annual weeds. I'm going to whiz through this really quickly, but really just to set the scene. So annual weeds, as most of you will know, are weeds that usually last 1 year and they'll die after seeding in that year, and they're generally spread by seed. So this includes all your major grass weeds, so blackgrass, ryegrass, barred oats, and then most of broadleaf weeds. And most of them are autumn and spring germination. So I will show a graph in a moment about germination patterns, but generally you have that peak in the autumn and peak in spring germination. So you need to get to know what weeds you've got to understand that if you're sowing a ley. So with grasses, they tend to have a short seed persistence. So they're not in your seed bank for too long, but again, I'll talk about some details of that in a moment. There is a dormancy issue with some of the grasses, so that is quite varied, and some of the species may remain dormant in the soil for a bit longer than others. But generally, the grasses, we have good cultural control options. So we can do a stale seed bed technique. We can use cultivation machinery to disturb the seed bank to get a flush of weeds. So again, I'll come back to this in a moment. But considerations with the broadleaf weeds, a lot of them have longer seed persistence. So something like poppy has a very long seed persistence in your soil. So you may not see it for a long time, do a particular cultivation, and then poppy can still become a problem. The other thing we really need to think about is herbicide resistance issues. This is really important to remember. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but if you're choosing a ley mix with perennial ryegrass, as many of them will have, we now have to consider issues for glyphosate resistance in ryegrass species. So we have found our first case of glyphosate resistance in Italian ryegrass in the UK, and this is something we're monitoring very closely and something perhaps we can talk about in our discussions afterwards, but this is something you really need to plan and consider if you have Italian ryegrass as a species on your farm. So thinking about the annual weeds in the weed seed bank. So Lizzie's talked a lot about soils. When I think about soils, I think about weeds in the soil. So where are those weeds? What are you doing with your cultivation? So basically, you're stirring up that seed bank all the time. You're burying fresh seed. You're moving seed around and bringing up older seed. So depending on how deeply you are cultivating the soil, you are always moving seeds. So some of those seeds will become dormant. Some of them will die. Some of them will be predated. And it's good to have seeds there, but you do have to think about the problem weeds and where you're moving those to. So your blackgrass, your ryegrass, your brooms. So before sowing your ley, really think about your seed bank and have a plan. Think about how you're going to cultivate, when you're going to cultivate, and what you're going to do. And then when you've established your ley, you really need to stop weeds from seeding. So you don't want more seed to go back into this seed bank and make it bigger. So I can't do a talk without a blackgrass picture. So unfortunately, this is the reality of resistant blackgrass. And certainly if you're in the east of England like we are, this is a very, very common sight. So thinking about seed return in this arable part of your rotation, if you had about 500 heads per metre squared, which is not uncommon, you would have a seed return of 35,000 seeds per metre squared. So that's a huge amount of seed potentially going back into your seed bank. So this is what I mean. You need to think about where you are, where your ley is going into your rotation, and how you can control those seeds potentially before you're sowing that ley. So as Georgie said at the start, the seed you're buying for your ley is very expensive. So you want to get the best and be able to establish the best you can from the start. So I touched on longevity. Weed seeds do vary. Just wanted to show a few examples here. Some will decline very quickly under a year, and they're easier to control from that point of view. Many weed seeds are within between about 1 and 5 years. So that's your perennial ryegrasses, your chickweeds, things like that. But some seeds will persist for longer. So we put blackgrass, Italian ryegrass in the over 5 years. Most will decline in about 5 years. But because you've always got a mix in your seed bank of seeds that have shed from different years, potentially you can never quite clear it. So there's always going to be a lot of seeds in the seed bank. And as I said at the beginning, something like common poppy can survive for decades, 50 to 100 years, and they can still be in your seed bank and persistent. So this really needs to be considered. Germination periods, again, as I said, really differ. So think about when you're going to sow, what are your problem weeds? If you have blackgrass, we get the peak emergence, as you know, with your arable cropping systems, September, October, November. Very little does emerge in spring, but we do get some. Again, different species spring wild oats, obviously much more likely to germinate in the spring. So think about the weeds you know you've got and when you're going to plant your ley and the best time to avoid having too many weeds within your ley. So moving on from annuals, I want to touch on perennials and biennials. So these are species that, different species that really have a life cycle of greater than 2 years for perennials. So it's something like your docks, your creeping thistle. They can spread by seed and vegetative parts, so your roots and rhizomes underground. And so again, if you're thinking about cultivation strategies, if you've been cultivating and chopping up the rhizome networks for thistles, you end up with lots more thistles, and they will all grow from these small segments. So you've really got to think about cultivation if you know you have perennial weeds in your system. So potentially if you were maybe an organic farmer, you may have more of a perennial weed issue in going into some of your crops. So really for control of these, you need a multiple control strategy. So I'll talk about that in a moment. And there's also the biennial. So sometimes ragwort may become a problem that you've not seen before, but it will appear perhaps in year 1 or 2 of your ley. And this again will complete its life cycle as a biennial within 2 years. And you may not have seen this in your arable rotation, but it will be there. And that also includes spear thistle, which can quite often become a problem or an issue within your ley. Saying that, some of these species are not, well, weeds are not all bad anyway, and some of these provide a brilliant resource for pollinators, for butterflies, for seeds for birds. So there can be a balance. There is a balance with some of these species, but what you want to do with your weeds is make sure none of these take over and dominate, because that's when they do become a problem and not a benefit. So thinking about controlling these perennials and biennials, the picture I've put there on the left, that's not actually in a herbal ley, it's a grass clover ley, but you can see how bad spear thistle can be. They actually look like mini molehills to me. But when the problem's bad, it's bad, and you've got to think about not letting that now come to seed and spread that problem. So you've got options of cutting, topping, maybe spot spraying. That we're very limited with herbicide use within our ley, so you've really got to spot spray and use weed wipers very carefully, because obviously you've spent a lot of money on your seed and you want the good mix and diversity of your ley species to stay there. If you are going to rotationally graze, that's really great, but don't end up with bare patches. The weeds will take advantage of any bare spaces, bare patches. So think about your grazing patterns, don't overgraze, and then try and reseed any areas of your ley to prevent those bare patches for weeds to dominate those. So management considerations, I would say pre-planning is essential. It's key to making sure your ley mix really takes and really does well. You want to really have a great coverage and not have weed competition in those first few years is crucial. Particularly, it could be a long-term ley, it could be a 3-year ley, but you really, really want a good sward quickly and not have the weeds competing. So preventing weed seed return. As I said, no real herbicide options. It's very limited. You can't just go and get a product and spray something out. Obviously, there's diversity within your ley. We can't do that. So spot spraying can be done, but I would say it's quite risky. So know your weed seed bank. Keep your ley as diverse as you possibly can, because that will suppress weed species and compete with them. So that includes keeping your seed rate high. With the grass weeds, the appropriate use of glyphosate as a stale seed bed before you plant is perfect if you're a conventional farmer. And other tools you have include other cultivations, cutting, topping, mowing, grazing, as we touched on. So there are a number of tools, but you really do need to pre-plan and make sure you know what you've got to start with. So the final key points, really, I'll say this again, really think about your weed seed bank, prevent that weed seed return, manage the individual species if problematic, so spear thistles, docks, that kind of thing. Monitor success and failure, because you will have success and you will have some weeds that are a problem to you. We have a lot of bristly oxtongue at Boxworth. They'll have that at Hope Farm as well. But again, in low numbers, it can provide a good resource. So it may not become a problematic weed if you keep on top of it. And as Lizzie just said at the end of hers, think about your cultivations before you go into the arable part of your rotation if it's a rotational ley, because do not undo all the good work you've done for 3 or 5 years and then plough up all those seeds that are in your seed bank. So you've got to really, really think about what cultivations you do before you go back into your arable crop. And finally, really just to highlight lots of great resources. So I've looked at a lot of videos. There's a lot of different things you can access, and sharing ideas, sharing other people's successes and maybe failures really will help you understand how you can get the best out of your ley in terms of weed management. So I've highlighted a few here that will, again, the slides will be available afterwards, but I would urge you to have a look at some of these resources. You can download things and there's lots of YouTube videos. So hopefully you can learn from the successes of other people. And I think at that point, I will leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lizzie and Lynn. I think, well, I've got, it's as typical as research is, I've got more questions now. Although it answers to lots of things, which is really useful. I think, yeah, just key points from Lizzie that it comes down to soil organic matter, and that's one of the key benefits from herbal leys, which it all boils down to with soil, I suppose. That 24% increase over 6 years, I think is amazing. But also recognising that's not after 1 year, that's 6 years of it, and how long those herbal leys need to be in, I guess, to see those benefits. I think that might be an element as well with your talk, Lynn, on the weed control, thinking about what weeds there are and how long they're going to need to not germinate to then not be viable in future years. And then my only other point, I love that we've got poppies on here. We came from a wildflower webinar and cultivated margins where poppies were an excellent thing last month, but the weed is just a nice plant but in the wrong place, as always. So after that, I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, who is Bex. And just a quick reminder as well, please do send questions in the Q&A as we go through, to help us have a little think about our answers as well. But Bex is a conservation project manager at Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and we'll talk about pollinators, bumblebees in particular, and what they need from herbal leys on farmland.
Thanks very much, Georgie, and thanks to everyone for coming along. Hopefully you can see my slides okay. All good? Brilliant, we'll get going. Oh, hang on. There we go, we're off. Cool, okie doke. So why pollinators? Why do we want to support pollinators in our farming system? So incorporation of herbal leys into your systems about building resilience across your farmed landscape for healthy soils, resilience for dry and wet weather conditions, whether it's carbon sequestration, looking to reduce inputs, or health of livestock, and many, many more things. So protecting and enhancing pollinator populations follows the same principles. So by supporting pollinators and their habitats, they can provide a wide range of benefits within your farm landscape, with just a few listed there. But no one pollinator species or even tens of pollinators can provide the pollination services or all of these services required. We need as greater diversity as possible. So it's been estimated around 88 to 90% of 300,000 flowering plants worldwide are animal pollinated. And in the UK alone, around 70% of our native flowering plants are insect pollinated. and a staggering 6,000 different insect species are believed to contribute to pollination services. Oh, I've jumped forward a zillion slides. There we go. So well-established and well-managed herbal leys can contribute to supporting pollinator populations. And before I went into a bit more detail about that, I just wanted to cover some of the points around the agri-environment options that are available and the differences between those. So there's obviously the SFI option, SAM3 for herbal leys, which is primarily intended as a soils option to improve structure and function of soils, resilience to drought, and produce forage with reduced fertilizer inputs. Under this option, there's no restrictions on grazing or cutting, and currently the recommended seed mix is a minimum of 5 species with 1 grass, 2 legume, and 2 herbs and wildflowers, but additional guidance under that option does recommend the same as GS4, including the rest periods. So even though that's the minimum required, there's nothing to say that you can't do much more. And then under countryside stewardship, the GS4 legume and herb-rich sward option, this option is intended to provide habitat and forage for invertebrates, including pollinators, as well as the benefits to soil structure and health. So there is a requirement under GS4 to rest your sward from grazing or cutting for 5 weeks between May and July. There should be 20% cover of legumes and herbs as well, which doesn't include white clover. And the recommendations for this option are for 5 species of grass, 4 species of legume, and at least 4 species of herb and wildflower as well. And then there is a bit of information about the sustainable farming scheme in Wales as well. So herbal leys are included in that under the option for temporary habitats on improved land under the universal actions layer, and they can help to meet the criteria of 10% of land managed as habitat to make up any shortfalls in semi-natural habitats. But permanent grasslands will be exempt from herbal ley creations under FSFS. And unfortunately, I looked, but I'm not so familiar with Scottish schemes or what's coming in Scotland, but I couldn't find any information about herbal ley funding in Scotland. So whether or not you're using herbal leys under agri-environment, it's really important that they are in the right place and aren't established in inappropriate places and at the expense of other high-value habitats for pollinators and other wildlife. So herbal leys in general aren't suitable for the habitats listed there, so semi-improved or semi-natural native grassland sites, hay meadows and species-rich grassland sites. So there's been some instances where the high financial incentives of the SFI option, which is great that it has a high financial incentive, but it has led to grasslands of high existing conservation value or good quality semi-improved grassland with high restoration potential being damaged or destroyed. Whereas these sites should be protected and entered into alternative options if you're using agri-environment schemes such as low input grassland or management of species-rich grassland. And it's the case that even the most diverse and well-managed herbal leys can't match the biodiversity value of species-rich grassland. And this isn't just due to the difference in flower species, it's due to the age of the sward, the complexity of soil biology, the fungal relationships, and the presence of lower plants as well as varied sward structures and retention of seed heads, to name just a few factors. However, hang on, I'm jumping again, sorry. They do represent one approach and an opportunity to introduce increased diversity and benefit to improve grasslands and the sort of standard rye and clover leys, to bring a bit more diversity into these, reduce inputs and potentially the benefits of livestock into arable rotations as well. Do consider your objectives though for the area of grassland that you're thinking about. So if you're looking to increase species diversity of grassland or restore grassland, there might be other management approaches other than the use of herbal leys that can take advantage of existing seed banks or local provenance seed through methods such as green haying or bale grazing or changes in grazing strategies. So seed mix choice and establishment. So I think as has been mentioned earlier, it's a bit of a balancing act and might require a bit of trial and error to find out what works for your system and for your objectives and to get the maximum benefits that you're looking for. And do seek advice from your agronomist or seed suppliers or ecologists if you're looking to improve sort of biodiversity through this. So establishment can be best achieved by ensuring you have the right mix for your soil type and conditions, and like any crop, and as has been described in the previous talks, ensuring you're giving the crop its best chance of success at the sowing and establishment phase. So which species to select for pollinators? So it's really important to have as diverse a mix of flowers as possible, including different flower shapes. So the reason for this being that a plant that can be accessed by a bumblebee with its long tongue may not be able to be accessed by a hoverfly, for example, which have short tongues and prefer open flower shapes. But thankfully, legumes are often a very common component within herbal leys and critical for that sort of nitrogen fixing. So legumes are a preferred group of forage plants, especially for bumblebees. And there's other additional benefits as well. So sandfoin and bird's foot trefoil, for example, are known to produce tannins and reduce frequency and quantity of antiparasitic treatment in livestock. And legumes such as white and red clover, trefoils and lucerne are protein rich and highly digestible. They can increase livestock growth rates and productivity, reducing the need for concentrate feed. There's also some evidence of some of these species helping to address mineral deficiencies by effectively mining soil minerals. So bird's foot trefoil, black medical, yellow trefoil, alsite clover, yarrow, chicory are all recommended species to address issues with mineral deficiencies in livestock, and all of those species also have value for pollinating insects as sources of pollinator nectar. However, it's really important to note as well that not all agricultural varieties of these species are equal in the eyes of pollinators. So in the same way that these varieties have been bred to have traits selected for yield or nutritional content or persistence, they also differ in what they can offer to pollinators and also in how they compare to the original wild type of these species. So there's not a huge amount of research in this area. It is a growing area, but there was a recent study looking at several red clover varieties. And long story short, they summarised that the varieties that produce the greatest density of flowers per unit area attracted the most pollinators. So that might not sound like rocket science, but it's worth bearing in mind when you're sourcing seed and getting advice from your supplier. And also that also assumes as well that the plants do get the opportunity to flower in those densities as well. So different management approaches and the impacts that these can have on pollinators. So a really key issue for herbal leys is maintaining sward diversity, and obviously maintaining that sward diversity is really important for maintaining those plant species in there for pollinators. So in general, herbal leys are best managed by mob grazing. So there's evidence that rotational grazing management can increase the productivity of a grassland as well. So set stocking can often lead to overgrazing, where plant regrowth is eaten and subsequent leaves are slow to emerge. Plants can become stressed. This means the leaf area is reduced, there's less energy and lower growth potential and lower root mass. And shallow and stressed roots don't have the same ability to access those soil nutrients as those swards that are allowed rest periods. And these rest periods are really key in allowing these swards to flower. So there'll be various different recommendations for rest periods. So at least 20 to 30 days in some cases, and to move the livestock on before the sward is overgrazed, always leaving a residual. There was a guide sort of 7 to 10 centimetres of growth. But some guidance recommends as much as 28 to 38 days minimum rotation. And these grazing breaks then allow the plants to regrow and to flower. So this produces continuous forage availability that pollinators need. As I mentioned, GS4 requires a 5-week break period. And if you're already grazing on rotation with a 35-day rotation, you automatically get this break built in. In the first year of establishment, consider cutting for hay or for silage rather than grazing, because this allows the sward to establish well and get roots down. Sheep especially can graze out some of the more palatable species and those species that are most valuable to pollinators. So yeah, in the first growing season especially, and as the sward's getting established. And rotational systems can also reduce that selective grazing of the most palatable plant species, such as the cloves and the herbs, to help to maintain that longevity of species diversity in the sward. And then for cutting systems, the key message really here is to leave uncut refuges. So harvesting of grassland biomass from mowing to baling does kill a large proportion of grassland invertebrates. So in some European studies, they found they sort of killing 65 to 80% of the invertebrates in the sward. So leaving uncut margins or patches on rotation can to some extent mitigate these losses and allow those invertebrate populations to bounce back. And also vitally for pollinators, it helps to avoid this sort of boom and bust nature of mass flowering crops, including herbal leys. So leaving uncut strips ensures that there's a continuous availability of pollen and nectar while the crop regenerates after harvest. And various studies, including our own on organic dairy farms, showed that fields with uncut margins maintained higher populations of bumblebees and other pollinators. Also, keeping these margins in the sunniest locations and the most flower abundant margins left behind provided the best resource for pollinators post-cutting. So I just want to describe briefly this bee steward model. There's a whole presentation on this, but along with the University of Exeter, we've been developing this computer-based decision tool. And in this instance, we used it to compare the effects of herbal leys and ryegrass leys on bumblebee populations. So bee steward works by combining the number of flowers in a ley in this case with the pollen and nectar value of those flowers for bumblebees, and simulates what will happen to bumblebee populations over several years under different types of management. So in this case, we sowed herbal ley mixes at 7 farms across Cornwall between 2018 and 2022. 2 were used then for cattle grazing, 2 for mob cattle grazing, 2 for sheep grazing, 1 was cut for silage, and 1 was cut for silage and subsequently cattle grazed. And then flower data from these farms was entered into a sort of model farm. There's an example up in the top left there. So the arable are the green fields, hedges are in blue, semi-natural grasslands are in pink, and purple are the leys. And then the model predicts what will happen to bumblebees over a period of 5 years under 2 management scenarios, one where the farms have herbal leys and one with ryegrass leys. So running the simulation for 1 year, we found about twice as much nectar is available for bumblebees in herbal leys from July to October, and over 5 times as much in early spring, which then supports newly emerging queen bumblebees. And then the plant species, which are particularly important, as buttercups are important in spring, not a component of herbal leys, could be considered a weed, but they're present in the spring. White clover, red clover and chicory in the summer, and dandelions as well all year round. And then after 5 years, the model predicted that there would be twice as many bumblebee colonies per kilometre squared and twice as many adult bumblebee queens on a farm with herbal leys compared to an equivalent farm with ryegrass leys. And then we looked at the different management scenarios. So clearly grazing and cutting affects flower abundance in the short term, and therefore the timing of this management will impact local bumblebee colonies. But we found that the sites under cattle grazing would reach a high of 15 to 30 flowers per metre squared, with the 2 mob graze sites reaching the highest flower densities. And sites cut for silage had the lowest flower density, but flowers did return after a couple of months. And then sheep graze site had consistently low, so lower flower abundance, but consistently low. So no boom or bust, but low to start with. Okie doke. So, and then sort of finishing up now, really. Just sort of.
Can I give you a minute or two?
Yeah, I've got 1 minute. Yeah. So even the best managed herbal leys aren't really a panacea for pollinator decline. So they're a really varied group of insects with a really wide variety of habitat requirements needed to fill their life cycle. So in order to support pollinators, you really need to look at how herbal leys interact with other habitats in the landscape. And I'll just keep this super brief with just a few interesting bits of information. So there's a chap called Tom Timberlake, and his studies are really worth looking up. And he found that whilst agri-environment schemes were really good at increasing overall forage provision, they weren't always so good at considering timing in line with cycles of pollinator life stages, such as bumblebee nest cycles. So lots of agri-environment scheme mixes flower in late spring or early summer. So missing kind of really vital spring and late sort of into autumn periods. And even gaps of 1 week can limit pollinators surviving through the year and creating the next generation. So this suggests, looking beyond your herbal ley. So looking at management of your hedgerows, whether you can leave rough and weedy corners, late flowering red clover crops, leaving flowering ivy in hedgerows and so on. And then just one more little bit that a later study by the same team found that bumblebees consistently forage from at least 10 different plant species at any one time of the year. And this is despite some plants being less abundant, so they're sort of disproportionately selecting them and looking for them. And this is believed that this is required, this diversity is required to access the full range of nutrients they need. So diversity and quality of pollen and nectar is as, if not more important than just pure quantity and abundance of flowers. So if I can leave you with one sort of top tip, it would be to get to know your farm and its habitats and identify those hungry gaps where flower resources may be lacking outside of your herbal leys. And that's me.
Wow, thank you, Bex. I hope people have tons of questions for that, particularly about that research, because that's fascinating, just seeing what the impact of herbal leys under different management can be for pollinators. I'm not going to say any more about that, except for I think the 1 week gap and how much of an impact that could have is massive. And yeah, the planning, and I think that's one thing that has come through consistently so far, is planning what management might be needed. And you said about cutting in year 1, so people thinking about what their costs versus income might need to be to address all of those things and get the best value, just to sort of manage expectations and to make sure that people are getting the best value out of the expensive seed that they're drilling. But yeah, I'm sure there'll be tons of people wanting to ask things through that. So I'm going to talk less myself so that we can have more time listening to other speakers, or our last speaker, I should say, who is Angus. Welcome, Angus. Thank you for joining. So Angus is a mixed beef and arable farmer covering 530 acres in the Vale of York, with a diverse mix of arable crops and permanent and temporary grassland. So loads of different situations and tons of expertise. We'll now talk about how he manages herbal leys to deliver for business, soils and biodiversity. And bring it all down to the practicalities. So thank you very much, Angus. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Georgine. That's great. So as Georgie says, in the Vale of York, on top of the Selby coal field, and 530 acres approximately of arable and grassland. The cattle that we have, we're pedigree herd of Solaires, 40 cows. We're high health and selling breeding stock. And we're really concentrating on breeding for maternal attributes, particularly for milk. So we're using breed plan to help us do that. And since we've gone down the herbal ley and the mob grazing route, really trying to keep all our insects alive, including the dung beetles, instead of automatically deworming when we bring the calves, wean the calves off and house them. We're now fecal sampling for egg counts, and we've mob grazed now for 4 years, and we've only had to deworm that first year. There was just a very low level. So there's a lot of attributes that herbal leys can bring, including the grazing strategy. And the predominant forage source now is very much herbal leys for the cattle. So as others have said, the multiple species in the mixture of grasses, legumes and forbs. I establish all my crops by direct drilling the whole farm for over 10 years now. So all the herbal leys are established by direct drilling. If they're temporary herbal ley, generally speaking, after winter wheat crops, as soon as the wheat's off and the straw is cleared, I'll drill the herbal ley into that. And we played about a little bit seeding herbal mixtures into an existing ryegrass field as well, with mixed success so far. We started with herbal leys in 2018, and after using clover and ryegrass leys, it was just a further development of that. And the drought resistance is phenomenal. In 2022, with a massive drought and the heat, then we were the only ones in the area with green grass or green forage, and we managed to go through the whole of the summer without any buffer feeding at all whatsoever, just relying entirely on the forage that would grow. So we do mob graze, and we have a fairly high cycle day, or high number of days between grazing. So in the peak period, it can be 60, 70 days of growth, and in the autumn before they come in, it can be down to 30-day cycle. And we're always aiming to keep a minimum 4 inches, 10 centimetre sward height, regardless of what the height of the grasses or the forages that the cattle have gone into. We're aiming to keep that 10 centimetres. And the same goes for when we're mowing as well. Just saying, when we're mowing a herbal ley, we keep that's quite a tall stubble, because so the grass area. So yeah, just check for compaction prior to drilling. Ensure the stubble of the previous crop is weed free. So I would treat with glyphosate prior to or just after drilling the herbal ley, and drilling as early as possible, because you are talking, particularly the clovers and things, they need heat. They need a warm soil, they need long day length, and they need sun. So they need to be in August. Very first week of September. I wouldn't go any later than that. So after a winter barley crop is ideal, because you're getting in that much earlier. And be very careful with herbicides, particularly sulfonyl ureas in the previous cereal crop, because they really can knock a herbal ley establishment to the point that you might well not actually have a herbal ley at all. So say we're aiming for that 4 inches stubble height, and keeping the forage in that maximum period of rapid growth to get the speed of recovery and speed of recovery as well, to get maximum dry matter output per hectare. So as I said, mob grazing or amp grazing, so adaptive multi-paddock grazing. So if you're not familiar with that, you have your fences within the field, splitting the field into alleyways basically, and you have 3 temporary fences that hold the livestock. So you've got a back fence, a front fence, and then you've got a second front fence, which is the next, just establishes the area for the next day's grazing. And then each morning you drop the existing front fence, move the livestock up into the next cell, put the fence back up, take down what was the back fence, and then put it in front. So that's what we do every morning, using the quad bike. It's very, very quick, and you get excellent control of how much the cattle or the livestock are eating. And depending on what stubble is left behind, and what they're going into, you may give them a bigger area or a smaller area each day to manage that. So that's our our setup. So 2 20-acre fields. Obviously, the upper field is temporary herbal ley, which is after the weeds, and the lower field is permanent grass with some legumes in that, and we're trying to increase that and make that into a herbal ley, basically. The blue line is the water pipe, and the little black lines, they demarcate, and on average grazing, 2 days grazing, which is what was put together for me, because I was starting to struggle to get my head around it. So we've got a central fence with a water pipe underneath it, and we run the temporary fences off that. But obviously, depending on how grass growth is, you may be giving them a very big area or very small area, so it's only as a guide. And then under that fence line is the water line. So on that water line, we're using a 30-gallon JFC high flow trough. I made up a metal skid to run that in. So in fairness, after 4 years, we still haven't had any breakages, so very pleased with that. And then behind the water trough, we tow salt lick mineral feeder to connect the water trough to the main, just 20 feet of fire hose, and then plus onto a female connector and male connector, very much like the hydraulics on the back of a tractor. So every 40 meters down the central pipe, there's an outlet, a female outlet. And as you move down the field, you just disconnect and reconnect as you go along. It's very, very easy to do. Not being funny, but the wife does it when I'm away with things. So it is easy to do. It's not difficult. That's just sort of a picture of what sort of growth we can get. And then on the quad bike there is the temporary fencing stakes on top. And that really does make life very easy and very quick. We have the whole herd runs together as one mob from middle of April on turnout through to middle of June when we take the bull out. So we're running one mob during that period, and then we split them into 2 mobs. So cows with heifer calves and cows with bull calves. So from mid-June through to the end of the year, we're running 2 mobs. So it's quite a bit of work, or quite a bit of ups and downs of fencing, but it's very straightforward and it is quick. So that's just midsummer picture. You can see all the chicory flowers there, and the diversity in the mixture and the clovers. We can clovers. That's from last year, or last grazing year. With the grasses sort of dominated early season last year. Every season's different, it seems. Partly with the age of the ley, and also just with the weather patterns. I think some weather patterns the grasses prefer and some the legumes prefer, but there is a lot of legume under there. And in the next pass, it was predominantly legume and predominantly clover rather than the grass. As I said, we do cut herbal leys as well. So we currently with sort of 20 acre of grazing ley, and then with 25 acre of another temporary ley, which is just for cutting, which is on the farm, and then some away from home as well. So first cut would be end of May, next cut sort of 6 to 8 weeks later, and then final cut will be mid-October, when things are slowing down. The thing that we need to be careful of, we do have a reasonable amount of chicory in our leys, herbal leys, including the grazing ley, and it's the fibrous matter of the chicory stalk. If it's too mature, the cattle just go on to eat it. So 6 to 8 weeks, we found that sort of gets the maximum growth we can out of the ley, whilst the chicory is still palatable to the cattle and still eatable. And I have to say, although there's sort of people do say that you get damage to the plastic wrap, We've never had any damage from the chicory stalks on the silage plastic. Termination is very straightforward. Cattle come out sort of end of November, or if we're mowing, end of October. Too late to go into a winter wheat, and I don't particularly like following something with a lot of grass in it with winter wheat. So I'll leave it green over the winter, acting really as a cover crop, and then glyphosate prior to drilling, and I'll include some MCPA or 2,4-D in there to ensure that we've got the chicory particularly killed. And the spring beans is what I follow the herbal ley with, and then come into a winter wheat after that. And the winter wheat yields are absolutely fantastic, I have to say, with not a lot of input. So the benefits of the AMP grazing, you know, we're not using any fertilizer at all on those herbal leys, none whatsoever, no N, no P, no K. We don't buffer feed now, we don't creep feed, haven't seen any reduction in weaning weights whatsoever. We're turning cattle out a week, 10 days earlier, and we're bringing cattle back in 6 weeks later. So a lot shorter housing period, and we can carry the same stock carry more stock on the same area because we're utilising maximum grass growth right the way through the season. And then you've even distribution of manures and your higher rainfall infiltration as well. So just some costings, just to put some figures on it. By reducing the buffer feed, or by eliminating the buffer feeding for both straw and silage, reducing the housing period, so we're not needing the silage to feed inside, we're not needing the bedding bales, we're not creep feeding, and we're not putting any nitrogen on. So the 28 hectares of herbal ley that we've got, the savings are fairly significant. So just under £10,000 saved per year. And that really equates to the AHDB figure for losses on a lowland suckler cow, which is about £250 a head year on year. Then if you want to add in the payments through the stewardship for the herbal ley, that's another £10,500 in the bank. So you know, we're looking at near as below £20,000 a year. The investment in the water pipes and fencing was just under £4,000, and that was once. I haven't had to replace any of the fencing or the water pipes or the water troughs. So that £4,000 in cost is going to last an awful long while. So that the savings really are significant, and with or without, don't let the government hear that or for what they're doing, but with or without the SFI payment, the stewardship payment, in my view, it's an absolute no-brainer. And the livestock are far healthier for it as well. We just don't have vet visits anymore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angus. Your depth of knowledge on how that works on your farm is huge. And it's just, yeah, it's fascinating to hear about the intricacies of how you manage the herbal leys from establishment right the way through. And yeah, the business benefits that you've had as a result as well. Is really good to see. I think there's a couple of things that I picked up on as the establishment, and actually the exit strategy as well sounded so sensible. And I know lots of people who had a herbal lay-in, and it's come out the other side with as many weed problems as they've gone in with, at least. So I think lots to be taken from that.
Yeah, it goes back to the once you've got the soil in or once you've got the crop established and you've made that initial decision not to disturb the soil, it really is a case you just do not disturb it after that. And with that 3, 4, 5 years of grass, and particularly if it's a herbal ley, not just a bog standard grass ley, the the soil comes out in such a great condition, you really just don't need to move it anymore.
I hope that will be the case when we come out of ours, but we'll see how it goes.
I'm sure it'll be great.
Now's time for our Q&A anyway. And so I'll bring Bex, Lynn, and Lizzie. If you could come back in, I'm going to open up the Q&A window and put that on my screen up there. I did also say to a couple of, if anyone, there's a few really nice links for different bits of research and stuff, or any websites. If anybody wants those, we can put those on the chat. So Bex has already shared a link to about the Hungry Gap research that I'm going to try and put on. We'll put on the chat in a minute once we get going, or we can share those with you at a later date. But I'll start from the top on questions anyway, and perhaps simpler or a short question anyway from Gemma to start off with, for Lizzie on the soils side of things. So in the trial that was done in Somerset, what depth was loss on ignition measured at?
Yep, so that was the top 15 centimetres because it was a lay arable rotation. We maintained sampling top 15 centimetres.
Well, super, thank you. And then we've got Morag here, who is a rural hedgehog officer at People's Trust for Endangered Species, which is just an amazing job. I think everyone has a soft spot for hedgehogs, and is really interested about what herbal leys might do for worms, earthworms, as that is one of the key issues apparently for hedgehog decline. So is there any research that has been done about the presence of hedgehogs on herbal leys? I'm going to put my hands up here and say I have no idea, but maybe if anyone else has, or Angus, if you've got any ideas about hedgehogs on your farm, it would be really, really nice to hear.
We do have them, and we do have the black and white things as well. But all I can say is not necessarily hedgehog related, but if it's an indicator, then for the hedgehogs will be similar, then that'd be great, because the uplift in biodiversity from herbal leys is absolutely huge, whether that be bees, butterflies, skylarks, hares, everything. Because linking it in with the amp grazing, you've always got habitat there that the animals or birds can go into and have cover. You know, we've got skylarks nesting in the herbal leys. We had pair of curlew this year. It was the first time I've had curlew on for a long while. And the hares are absolutely loving it. So whilst I can't specifically say about hedgehogs, the biodiversity uplift from having herbal leys on the farm is huge.
Yeah.
I was going to add as well that again, I don't know of any specific research on hedgehogs and herbal leys, but some of the management techniques that I was describing in terms of sort of leaving, well, the rotational grazing, but also leaving uncut margins and that kind of thing, don't just apply to pollinators, but obviously is massively beneficial to all sorts of wildlife and biodiversity in terms of, you know, leaving those refuges and shelter and overwintering habitat and that kind of thing. And then specifically on the worms, I don't know that much about hedgehog diets or the specific types of worms that they like to eat, but I wonder whether it would depend on, I assume they're feeding on sort of litter feeding worms, you know, they're not digging particularly deep, are they? So I don't know whether herbal leys increase the amount of those kind of litter feeding worms or whether it's the more sort of deep burrowing worms and whether that might make a difference. But there's some research to be done.
That's a really good point. And I think, Lizzie, do you have an idea on what kind of earthworms we have?
I love it because we tend to get excited when you see increases in worms because it's great for soil health. And I must admit, I'd never thought of it in the context of earthworms before. I just did check back at the data from Norwood, where we had both grass and clover lays and herbal lays, and that increase in number and biomass of worms was very similar between the grass and clover and herbal lays. So I think that, you know, to expect to see an increase in the number of worms, particularly if you're putting, you know, you're putting down taking arable fields and putting them down to herbal lays. In terms of the increase in biomass, it was more we had a shift from more juvenile worms to adult worms over the 3 years, which really indicates just a more stable population. You're not tilling and disturbing the soil, so you've got you know, you're enabling a more stable population to develop.
Yeah, and with not wanting to make sure we get through other questions, but was the sampling, how deep was the sampling done? I'm just wondering if it was in that sort of top layer, if that's accessible to.
Yeah, so that we do that as part of the visual examination of soil structure assessments, where you basically dig out a spit of soil. So you dig out a spade full of soil, usually 20 by 20 by 20 centimeters, a block of soil, and then we count the number of earthworms in that block of soil and then scale up from there. Super.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, on that note, just whilst we're talking about like the resting periods and things, this is what I do as chair. I feel like I can take over sometimes, not too much. But yeah, as you were saying, for other species, it's so important. And Angus, you mentioned about skylarks, because skylarks, they use herbal leys. And I think that's where, as well, it's important to recognise the benefit of having a herbal ley where you can have that mob grazing rather than necessarily a cutting regime, which could be, it could be quite tricky for nesting birds, really, when we've got to do some cutting, which is the only management that you'll do in a legume fallow. And it's a shorter, well, I don't, because you can't graze those, I don't think, can you?
No, you can't graze them. I'm not sure on I can't remember. I've got legume fallow, but I can't remember the rules, stipulations regards cutting them during the season, as it were. And that, again, the requirement for that would depend how many years the legume fallow was in for.
Yeah, totally. But I mean, yeah, another big one for a herbal ley there, I reckon. So there's a couple of, well, there's a question here about the need for sulfur on herbal leys. Has anyone, we've not done anything of the sort, but has anybody got any experience on or why sulfur might be needed at any given time?
So, I mean, you could draw parallels to work that we've done on grass, and also we know grass responds to sulfur, and we know legumes also have sulfur demand. The principle that we're at higher risk of sulfur deficiency on lighter, sandier soil and higher rainfall areas. You could, if you were concerned about sulfur deficiency, look to the recommendations for grass and grass clover swards and look at applying that. The challenge is that you tend to apply sulfur with nitrogen, and a lot of people with these swards don't want to be applying any nitrogen. So it's that practicality of how you would do that. And also bear in mind that these swards are graze swards, so we are going to have an element of recycling from the grazing animal as well. So that was sort of a bit of a mumbled response of, you know, different thoughts of, yes, probably, you know, might respond to sulfur. If you were putting nitrogen on, I'd probably put sulfur on that with that. But the challenge is, I'm imagining most people with these swards aren't putting nitrogen on. And now, Angus, I'm going to ask you whether you want to sort of jump in and comment there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't put any nitrogen on mine at all. You could, or I could, I suppose, use some of the sulfur pellets that you can get, which they tend to be quite slow release, so that would be good. The only thing I do is I just sort of put a general foliar tonic on sometime around now as the herbal leys are getting going, and then this isn't so much the grazing, but this is more the cutting ley, and then after each cut, I'll reapply or go on with that tonic again once it's greened up again. So it's just sort of a multi-nutrient tonic, really.
Yeah.
There is
I
there is sulfur in that.
Yeah, I guess if you were looking to put potash on, you could go with something like polysulfate that had both a potash and a sulfur on.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd only be particularly noting it if you were on a lighter sandy soil where we know we're at a higher risk.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. Useful words there, and touching on needs for just nurturing and providing a bit of nutrients in general for lay management and which situations. Another question we've got here is about alternatives to glyphosate. So that's been mentioned in both establishment and in termination of herbal leys, and is used by regenerative farmers and farmers that don't want to cultivate and are moving towards direct drilling methods an awful lot. I'm thinking this might be more of, we just, to be honest, at Hope Farm, we used glyphosate in terminating our previous crop after establishing we cultivated, knocked it down, got as fine a seed bed as we could, rolled, and then it did a last spray before drilling our herbal ley. We haven't got to the termination phase of it yet, but that's kind of the obvious choice for us. I think if we had enough of a window, we might be able to do more cultivations as an alternative, but then that doesn't really sing to the same hymn sheet of what you were saying, Lizzie. So that's my 2 pence, and I think maybe Angus, if we start with you and your thoughts.
Yeah, you're caught between the devil and deep blue sea in a way. You either cultivate the heck out of it to kill the clover and chicory and everything else, which the organic guys would do, or you go down the chemical route. There isn't any other option, unless you sort of look at these gas burners or whatever. But I don't think many of those would actually kill chicory, red clover, etc., that are very deep rooting. So you've got to go one or the other. You either plough it down and cultivate, or you use the glyphosate.
Yeah, that's a good point actually, because there are potentially, if we're reducing or stopping glyphosate use in future, which people are talking about, sort of the electronic weed control and the zappers and things are given as a viable alternative if they're more affordable. But if it doesn't affect the deep rooting stuff, that could really change what we want to be growing in herbal leys in future, and changes the whole, and then that integrates with drought resistance as well, I suppose.
Yeah.
So on that point, again, I think you're right. Really, at the moment, glyphosate is the easiest, cheapest way if you're conventional, and that would be the best tool you've got. But there are alternatives coming through. We're starting to see things coming from veg into arable systems. So the electrical weeder, they've teamed up now. So Rootwave have teamed up with Garford's, and they're talking about developing something that's more for bed production in vegetable systems, but we could potentially see something coming for the future that maybe we could be zapping some of these. There's the crimper roller system that some people use for destroying cover crops. So again, some of the thicker stemmed things may work better if they're broken down with a crimper roller, but then it still could be a problem into your next crop. So we may see some more alternatives coming through, but at the moment, certainly in conventional systems, glyphosate is the most effective way. There are no kind of chemical alternatives to glyphosate that would have the same effect.
Maybe it's another project for ages.
Yeah, we are looking into, and then within the Operate project, we are looking at other alternatives, but obviously on field scales, a lot of these systems are developed in field veg beds. And laser weeding, electrical weeding, it's all suited to other crops at the moment on field scale and terminating these crops. So there is a system with the new farm crop zone. They call it an electricide, so it's a liquid chemical. So it's for potato desiccation. Again, now used in the UK. So you spray the electricide on the front and you're kind of zapping the crop from behind on the tractor. So that is a system that's now available in the UK, but these things are going to take time to come through, and obviously people have got to be able to invest in the equipment and see how effective it is. So, you know, glyphosate being very effective at the moment is an easy way for people to destroy them.
I mean, what a mad new world we might be living in, to be honest, with all of those things coming through. Lizzie, you're off mute. Had you got anything else to add before we move on?
No, I think I just hadn't put myself back on mute, but I'm
Okay,
going to let
that's
Lynn
fine.
take any questions on glyphosate.
Yeah, 100%. Speak to the cultural weed control expert. And then we have another question here on is there a method to examine rooting depth that anybody would recommend?
Dig a hole.
A spade, I think I
Yeah.
I mean, if we're doing an R&D project looking at rooting, we'll take cores and wash roots out and weigh them. It's hugely time consuming and expensive. I think you can tell an awful lot by just digging a hole and looking at how the roots are growing and, you know, where the majority of the root mass is. And that also gives you the advantage that you're assessing soil structure and doing that as well.
Yeah, I think it's always fascinating, like how much information you can get from digging a hole with the spade, and you can really, especially looking at the roots down through the soil profile, if all of your roots are going 2 centimeters and then growing horizontally, or 3 inches and then growing horizontally, it tells you an awful lot about what's going on.
Yeah.
Angus, have you looked at rooting depth a lot on your herbal lays?
Not hugely. I've dug some soil pits, but you're shattered after a while. Sort of going on the figures, you know, chicory potentially down to 2 meters. Red clover is deep. I'm not sure how deep red clover will go, but it's deep rooting as well. So yeah, they're significant.
Yeah, no, definitely. Brilliant. I mean, there's just so many different elements. I think we've touched on so many different things this evening. We've come to the end of our questions. Unless anybody does anyone have anything further to say here before I try my best to summarize on what we've chatted about this evening? No, that's fine then. I mean, thank you to everyone who's joined us. Thank you so much to each of you speakers who've given so many different angles on growing herbal leys, on practical management, what they can do, and the research that Bex, Lynn and Lizzie have done under all those different situations, I think is just fascinating. We're always learning at the Time and Hope Farm, so I love holding these webinars as we pick up different things on what we either should have done or could do in the future. The research papers that are mentioned, I'm going to try and collate those so that we can send them in an email to everyone who's attended. And we've got a recording of this that we will post up on the Farm Wildlife YouTube channel. Hopefully in the next week, we should be able to get that on. And there's historic webinars are also on there, talking about everything from hedgerows, ponds, through to agroforestry and cover crops. So lots of different things to talk about there. Lizzie's just put a link in there from the AHD project reports from Somerset Farm as well, so we can share all of that. You can all have 4 or 3 minutes of your evening back now, and yeah, thanks so much to everyone who's helped organise and make this one possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stop the recording.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.